John Harris never imagined that one day his own daughter would look him in the eye and tell him he was too old to be part of the family. At 63, a retired fire chief who had once carried people out of burning buildings, he was suddenly told he couldn't even handle a vacation. His daughter Melissa waved the glossy Hawaii brochure with excitement. Her husband Eric nodded along. And Eric's parents Walter and Jeanette sat on John's couch, already planning snorkeling trips and sunset dinners. The sting came when Melissa smiled politely and said, "Dad, you should just stay home and look after the house." The very house John had worked his entire life to pay off. The same house where he and his late wife Linda had built every memory. Walter was 65, 2 years older than John. Yet somehow he was invited while John was dismissed, as Melissa's voice bubbled with plans. John sat frozen, his chest tightening. 5 years of providing them free housing, groceries, and covering. Eric's endless mistakes, yet now in his own living room. He was being told he wasn't fit to come along. That night, when laughter carried through the vents, John would discover their real plan. But in that moment, with brochures spread across his table and his daughter's words echoing in his ears, one truth burned hotter than any fire he'd faced before. He had just been erased from his own family's future. That night, the Harris house was alive with laughter, but none of it felt warm to John. He sat upstairs in his bedroom, still wearing the same shirt from dinner, staring into the mirror on Linda's old vanity. The man who looked back at him was a stranger, someone his own daughter now considered invisible. He told himself he'd try to read, maybe one of Linda's favorite mystery novels. Anything to drown out the sound of their excitement downstairs. But then he heard something that froze his blood. Through the old heating vent near his feet. Voices carried more clearly than they should have. Eric's low chuckle first. "Honestly, I think you bought that whole too old excuse." John's hand tightened around the closed book. He leaned closer, heart hammering in his chest. Melissa's voice followed, casual, cruel. "Dad's always been gullible. Remember when we told him we'd pay back the roof repairs?" Their laughter cut through him like shards of glass. And then came Walter's voice, the man invited on the trip in his place. "Perfect timing. Soon as we get back from Hawaii, we'll put him in that nursing home. Sunset Ridge has an opening next month." John's breath caught. "Home." His daughter's voice rose with excitement. "I already talked to a realtor, Zach Allen. He thinks we could get at least $800,000 for the house, maybe more. Split 4 ways, that's a good start." The words rattled through the vent like a death sentence. For 5 years, John had carried this family. He'd paid their grocery bills, let them live under his roof rent-free, and even covered Eric's medical expenses after his so-called business ventures collapsed. He'd taken his pension and savings money Linda had once dreamed of using for road trips, together, and poured it into keeping Melissa's family afloat. And now they were plotting his disposal like he was an old sofa taking up too much space. He gripped the edge of the window frame until his knuckles went white. The betrayal felt physical, like fire pressing against his chest. He remembered the night 5 years earlier when Eric had called him, voice cracking with desperation, begging for help after gambling debts swallowed their home. "We've got nowhere to go, Pops, please." At the time, Melissa was pregnant, and John couldn't bear to see his grandchildren without shelter. He opened his door, his wallet, and his heart, and this was the repayment. John sat back on the bed, staring at the shadows on the wall. His late wife Linda had warned him gently, years ago, about Melissa's growing entitlement. But John, ever the rescuer, the man who had pulled strangers from burning buildings, thought he could rescue his own daughter from herself. What he hadn't realized until this moment was that in trying to save them, he had handed them the tools to betray him. The conversation below shifted into laughter about snorkeling, sunset dinners, and helicopter rides. Their voices carried upward. Not knowing he had already heard enough to change everything, John rose slowly, walking to his dresser. In the bottom drawer sat a wooden box holding Linda's wedding ring, her letters, and the deed to the house. He held it in his hands, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel powerless. He felt clarity. They thought he was a burden. They thought he was too old to matter. They thought they could erase him from the story of his own life. But John Harris had spent decades commanding fire crews, making life-and-death decisions under pressure. He wasn't about to roll over and surrender his dignity in the silence of that late Colorado night. He began sketching a different kind of plan. Not the plan they expected. Not the plan of a weak-old man shuffled off into a nursing home. This would be the plan of a man who still had fight left in him, a man who finally understood that kindness without boundaries only feeds entitlement. When dawn crept through the blinds, John already knew what he had to do. The family downstairs believed they were heading for paradise. What they didn't know was that by the time they returned, paradise would have turned into ashes, and the house they plotted to steal would be gone forever. Sleep never came to John Harris that night. Instead, he sat in the half-light of his bedroom, his late wife Linda's jewelry box open on the dresser, the house deed resting beside her wedding ring. Their laughter downstairs still echoed in his ears: nursing homes, real estate agents, inheritance. Words that turned his 5 years of sacrifice into nothing more than a business plan for his years. As the hours dragged on, John found himself reaching for the small spiral notebook he had kept since Linda's passing. She had always told him, "You'll want to know where the money goes, Johnny? It adds up faster than you think." He'd followed her advice, jotting down every household expense in careful handwriting, page after page. Now, as he flipped through those records, the weight of betrayal grew heavier with every line. There it was: groceries. Melissa and Eric had 5 mouths to feed, and the tally of supermarket trips added up to more than $25,000 over the years. John could remember pushing the cart himself, stocking the fridge. While Eric sat in the living room playing video games on a console, John had bought next-dash utilities: water, gas, electricity. All doubled since Melissa's family moved in. Nearly $10,000 extra poured into monthly bills. And not once had anyone offered him a dime. He turned another page. The roof repair, $14,200 after that brutal Colorado hailstorm. Melissa had promised they'd pay him back once Eric got back on his feet. John stared at the neat red check mark beside the word loan. That was 3 years ago. Repayment had never even been mentioned again. And then the medical bills. Eric had let their insurance lapse when their youngest needed an emergency room visit for a broken arm. It was John's credit card that saved them from collection notices. Over $8,000 in hospital costs never repaid, barely acknowledged. One page after another told the same story. Car repairs, school clothes, sports equipment, holiday gifts. Nearly $70,000 drained from his pension and savings. Money Linda had hoped would take them on cross-country road trips in their retirement. Instead, that money had gone into keeping. Afloat a daughter who had begun to see her father not as family, but as a walking ATM. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He remembered the night Melissa first showed up at his door, crying, children in tow, Eric trailing behind. With excuses about lost jobs and bad luck, Linda had already passed, and the house felt cavernous and empty. In that moment, the thought of laughter and family life filling those rooms again had been too tempting to resist. He let them in, believing he was saving his daughter, but as the years rolled on, gratitude curdled into entitlement. Melissa no longer asked, she expected. Eric no longer apologized, he joked about borrowing money. Even Walter and Janet, who had only met John a handful of times, acted as though his home belonged to them by right. He closed the notebook, pressing both hands against its worn cover. He thought of Linda. She had been the practical one, always, able to see through charm and excuses. "You're too soft-hearted, Johnny," she used to tease. But she'd also admired that same quality, the man who could risk his life in burning buildings. Still had tenderness for his family now. He realized that softness had been twisted. Against him, in the gray silence of early morning, John rose and walked through the quiet house. In the living room, the brochures for Maui still lay scattered. Across the coffee table, pictures of palm trees, golden sand, ocean sunsets. The trip they said he was too old for. He picked up one brochure and studied it carefully. The irony was sharp. Melissa had planned to take him out of his own home, send him to a nursing facility, while she and Eric enjoyed the very vacation Linda had once dreamed of for the two of them. John set the brochure down. Something inside him shifted, solidified. He was no longer the man who accepted excuses, who nodded along to empty promises. For the first time in years, he felt the fire that had carried him through decades. As a fire chief, the determination to act decisively when others hesitated. Asterisk, they thought he was finished. They thought his years of usefulness were over.
Ow.
But John Harris wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. By the time Melissa and her family boarded their flight to Hawaii, John had already decided the sacrifices he'd made would no longer be a leash around his neck. The house, the savings, the life he had built with Lyndon, of it would be handed over to people who saw him as disposable. Melissa believed she was writing the final chapter of his life. What she didn't know was that John was about to pick up the pen himself. The morning air was crisp in Denver when John Harris stepped into the kitchen. The house, unusually quiet. Melissa and Eric were buzzing around upstairs, getting ready for their big trip to Hawaii. Coat cases rolled across the hallway. Voices rose and fell with excitement. To them, it was just another day closer to paradise. To John, it was the dawn of a new resolve. He sat at the breakfast table with his coffee, staring at the Maui brochure Melissa had left open. The glossy photos mocked him: golden beaches, palm trees swaying, families laughing together under the Hawaiian sun. Families that included everyone, not ones that cast aside their fathers as though they were no longer useful. He had spent half the night running numbers, going over every note he had made in that expense book, every sacrifice he'd carried for them. By sunrise, the decision was clear. He wasn't going to wait until they shipped him off to a nursing home. He wasn't going to stand by while they sold the house he had poured his life into. No, he would make the first move. After breakfast, when Melissa breezed through the kitchen, chirping about flight times, John smiled faintly and offered to drive them to Denver International. "Saves you the cost of an Uber," he said. Eric clapped him on the back, calling him a lifesaver, completely unaware of the irony. They thought they were outsmarting him, planning behind his back. But they had underestimated the man, who had led fire crews into burning buildings for 3 decades. Once the front door closed, and the car pulled away with the family's luggage, John's shoulders straightened. For the first time in years, the house was silent. His house, his alone. He poured a fresh cup of coffee, sat at the table, and picked up his phone. He dialed the name Melissa had foolishly mentioned the night before. Zachary Allen. "Realty, this is Zachary speaking, Mr. Allen," John said calmly, his voice steady. "My name is John Harris. I need to sell my home as quickly as possible." There was a pause on the line, then a shift in tone, professional, interested. "How quickly are we talking, Mr. Harris?" 2 weeks at most. I'm willing to price it aggressively for a fast sale." "That's ambitious," Allen admitted. "But with no mortgage or liens, it might be possible." "Where's the property?" John gave the address, his voice firm. He laid out the details: 4 bedrooms, 2 1/2 baths, 2,800 square feet. Updated kitchen, new roof, established neighborhood. Paid off in full. No loans, no debt. Just his name on the deed. Allen's tone sharpened. "Can be there within the hour. With the right pricing and a cash buyer, we can move very quickly." "1 hour works," John said. "I'll be waiting." He hung up the phone and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For 5 years, Melissa and Eric had made the decisions how the money was spent, what repairs were necessary, even what groceries to buy. He had gone along believing he was helping family. But this was different. Now he was the one setting the terms. He retrieved the house deed and property tax documents from Linda's jewelry box, stacking them neatly on the table. Each paper carried weight, not just in ink and signatures, but in history. This was the home where Linda had planted her rose garden, where Melissa had learned to ride her bike in the driveway, where every Christmas morning had been spent around the same tree. It wasn't just a house. It was his life's work. And if his own daughter saw it only as a payday, then it was time to strip that illusion away. When Zachary Allen arrived, a man in his 40s with a sharp blazer and a tablet in hand, he stepped inside with a realtor's calculating eye. "Beautiful home," he said, running a hand along the polished wood banister. "You've taken good care of it. John nodded. My late wife believed in keeping things in order. She would have wanted it this way. They walked through the rooms together. Every corner was familiar to John, but now he saw it differently. Not as a prison of obligations, but as an asset one he could use to free himself from Melissa's grip. 2 weeks is fast, Zachary said finally, tapping notes into his tablet. But with cash buyers, it can be done. You'll have to accept. Less than market value? Speed matters more than price, John replied without hesitation. For the first time in years, John Harris felt like the one in control. Melissa thought she had orchestrated everything. But by the time she and Eric returned from sipping cocktails on Maui's beaches, their perfect plan would crumble. The man they thought too old, too soft, too gullible, was about to prove he was. Still capable of fighting fire with fire. The morning, Melissa and Eric left for Hawaii. John Harris drove them to Denver International Airport with the same calm, steady hands that once gripped the wheel of a fire truck. Melissa chatted the whole way about helicopter tours and snorkeling packages. Eric joked about tropical drinks, and Walter and Janet chimed in with their own excitement. None of them suspected that John's mind was already miles ahead of them. At the curbside drop-off, Eric clapped John on the shoulder. Thanks, Pops. You're a lifesaver. John smiled faintly. Just take lots of pictures. I'd love to see Hawaii through your eyes. They wheeled their suitcases toward the terminal, not bothering to look back. John sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, watching them disappear into the crowd. Then he shifted the car into gear and drove home, not as their chauffeur, but as a man about to reclaim his life. By the time he walked back into the quiet house, he already had the plan mapped out. Melissa and Eric had believed they were clever, whispering through the vents about selling his home and stashing him away in a nursing facility. What they didn't know was that every word had been a gift. They'd handed him their blueprint, and he intended to flip it upside down. John pulled out his notebook, making a checklist with the same precision he once used to coordinate fire crews. First, pack their belongings. Second, move everything to storage. Third, finalize the sale. Fourth, disappear on his own terms. He started with Melissa's room. Felt strange, almost surreal, to stand in the same bedroom he had once painted pink when she was 10 years old. Now the space was crowded, with expensive clothes, handbags, and jewelry purchases made with money that had come from his pension and savings. He opened drawers, carefully folding each blouse, each dress, and placing them into sturdy boxes he had bought that morning from a moving supply store. Every item carried a silent memory, but also a bitter truth. These weren't the possessions of a struggling family. These were the trappings of entitlement, funded by a father too soft to say no. Next, he moved into Eric's space. Stacks of gaming equipment, cryptocurrency guides, and half-finished Gitrick books littered the shelves. John packed them all neatly, resisting the urge to toss them into the trash. Even failure deserved proper closure, he labeled the boxes Eric office with a thick black marker, each stroke steady, deliberate. It took hours, but John didn't rush. He worked methodically, just as he had during long nights at the firehouse, when pacing himself meant surviving the shift. By late afternoon, the house was filled with boxes stacked waist-high, ready for transport. The next morning, a moving truck pulled up, its side painted with cheerful blue letters, "Mile High, Moving in Storage." 2 young movers hopped out, surprised by the sheer volume of belongings, family moving out. One of them asked casually, "Something like that," John replied. "Just load it all carefully. These things don't belong to me anymore." The movers worked efficiently, hauling box after box, carrying furniture, and eventually filling the truck. John followed them to a storage facility just 20 minutes away. Rosa, the manager, greeted him warmly at the counter. It was a kind woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "You'll need a unit big enough for a household," she said, tapping at her computer. "Climate-controlled, secure access. 6 months prepaid will keep everything safe." 6 months will be perfect, John answered, sliding an envelope of cash across the counter. He walked with Rosa to inspect the unit. Inside, the concrete space echoed as the movers began unloading. John stood back, watching his daughter's life in boxers disappear behind a rolling metal door. Each thud of a dolly, each slam of a box against the floor, felt like punctuation, a period, at the end of a long, painful sentence. When the last piece of furniture was in place, Rosa handed him the lock and keys. All set. You'll be the only one with access. John closed the door, snapped the lock shut, and pocketed the keys. It was finished. Melissa and Eric still believed they were returning to the same house they had left behind. Instead, they would return to find their belongings neatly packed away in a storage unit, their inheritance erased in one clean stroke. That evening, John returned to his now quiet home. For the first time in 5 years, the living room was empty of clutter. The kitchen counter was free of half-empty coffee mugs and abandoned snacks. The air itself seemed lighter. He sat in his recliner, staring at the mantel where Linda's photo still rested, her smile frozen in time. "I did it, Lynn," he whispered softly. "I finally took the house back." In that silence, John Harris felt something he hadn't felt in years: control. Real control. No one was eating his food without thanks. No one was leaving unpaid bills on his counter. No one was planning his future behind his back. Melissa believed. She had secured her paradise. But John knew the truth. The paradise belonged to him now. By Monday morning, the silence inside John Harris's home felt almost sacred. For the first time in years, the walls didn't echo with Melissa's complaints, Eric's excuses, or the children's unchecked noise. It was just John, a pot of coffee, and the steady rhythm of his own thoughts. The realtor, Zachary Allen, arrived right on schedule, his navy blazer crisp against the late summer Colorado sun. He carried a tablet tucked under one arm and the kind of brisk confidence John recognized from his own years as a fire chief, someone who knew how to move quickly when time mattered. "Mr. Harris," Zachary said, shaking his hand firmly,
Thanks.
"for letting me come by on such short notice. Let's talk strategy." John nodded, leading him inside. The house, now stripped of Melissa and Eric's clutter, looked larger, brighter. Hardwood floors gleamed. The kitchen counters sparkled. It felt ready to start a new life, just as he was. They sat at the dining table where John had once eaten countless family dinners. Meals that too often ended with Melissa scrolling on her phone and Eric whining about money. Now, the table was stacked with documents, deed, insurance papers, tax records, the weapons of a different kind of battle. Zachary tapped at his tablet. "Your timeline is aggressive. Normally a sale like this would take 4 to 6 weeks. But since the property's paid off and the title is clear, there's another option: cash. Buyers, they'll expect a discount, but they can close in under 2 weeks. That's what I want," John said firmly. "Speed matters more than squeezing every dollar." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "Most sellers want the highest price." "You sure?" John leaned back in his chair. "My family has already calculated what they think this place is worth. Let's just say they'll be in for a surprise when they come back from their vacation." The realtor studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Understood." Within days, the plan snapped into motion. Zachary lined up a meeting with a real estate investment firm, Pinnacle Property Holdings, a group that specialized in buying homes fast, then turning them into rental properties. On Wednesday afternoon, John found himself shaking hands with James Clark, a sharply dressed man in his 50s, who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to closing big deals. "Mr. Harris, this is a beautiful property," Clark said after a brisk tour. "Great bones, updated roof, strong neighborhood. We can make this work." They sat down in the living room, sunlight streaming through the blinds. Clark got straight to the point. "We'll pay cash. No inspections, no contingencies. We'll need you to agree to a slightly reduced price." "How reduced?" John asked. "About $60,000 below market value," Clark replied. "That allows us to move quickly and cover our risk." John thought of his notebook, the years of grocery bills, repairs, medical expenses he'd shouldered without complaint. $60,000 was almost exactly what Melissa and Eric had drained from him over 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on him. He smiled faintly. You have a deal? The handshake sealed it. By Friday, the paperwork was ready. John sat in a title office downtown, pen in hand, the documents spread out before him. Deed transfer. Disclosure. Forms. Settlement sheet. Each signature was a step away from the life Melissa had chained him to. Each initial was a declaration that he was done being anyone's burden. Congratulations. Mr. Harris, the notary said as she stamped the final page, as of today, the property officially belongs to Pinnacle Holdings. John exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. For 35 years, that house had been the center of his life, where Linda had planted her roses, where Melissa had taken her first steps, where every Christmas had been celebrated. And now, with a few strokes of a pen, it no longer belonged to him, yet he didn't feel loss. He felt something far more powerful: liberation. Walking out of the office, a check in hand, John felt lighter than he had in years. The house Melissa and Eric thought was their golden ticket was gone, sold legally, cleanly, and forever out of their reach. That evening he stood in his now nearly empty living room. The movers had already taken Melissa and Eric's belongings to storage, and soon Pinnacle's contractors would be preparing the space for tenants. John picked up Linda's framed photo from the mantel and whispered, "We did it, Lynn. We finally took it back." Outside, the sun dipped below the Rockies, casting a fiery glow across the horizon. John poured himself a glass of bourbon, sat in his recliner, and savored the moment. Melissa's family was somewhere in Maui, sipping cocktails and laughing at his expense. But when they returned, they would find strangers in the house they thought was theirs, and John Harris, the man they had dismissed as too old, too soft, too gullible, would be long gone, carrying both his freedom and their lesson in the palm of his hand. By the time Monday rolled around, the sale of John Harris's home was official. The check from Pinnacle Holdings rested in his bank account. More money than he'd seen since Linda's life insurance payout years ago. For most people, selling a house might feel bittersweet. But for John, it felt like the sweetest form of justice. The house his daughter Melissa had once called her inheritance was no longer hers to claim. That evening, John sat at his kitchen table, the same table where Melissa had brushed him off so many times, and opened his laptop. He clicked onto the website of the Maui resort Melissa had gushed about: photos of infinity pools, golden beaches, private lanais overlooking the ocean, the very place she told him he was too old to enjoy. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a moment. Then he booked himself a 2-week stay. First-class flights included, paying in full with money from the house sale. He chuckled softly to himself. Too old for Hawaii, am I? We'll see about that. 2 days later, John wheeled a single suitcase into Denver International Airport. Unlike Melissa and Eric's mountain of designer luggage, his was simple: just clothes, a few keepsakes, and Linda's photo tucked safely inside. At the ticket counter, the agent scanned his boarding pass. "Mr. Harris, you're flying first class today. Congratulations." "Thank you, John," replied with a steady smile. He hadn't sat in first class once in his life. For years, he had put others ahead of himself: Linda, Melissa, the grandkids, even Eric and his endless disasters. Now, finally, he was putting himself first. As the plane lifted off, John gazed out the window, watching the Rocky Mountains fade beneath a blanket of clouds. He thought of Melissa's words, "You're too old for adventures." The irony was so sharp, it made him laugh. At 30,000 feet, champagne in hand, John Harris felt younger than he had in years. 9 hours later, he stepped off the plane into the warm Hawaiian breeze. The scent of salt water and hibiscus flowers wrapped around him, welcoming him into the very paradise his family had denied him. The resort shuttle carried him down a coastal road lined with palm trees until it pulled into the driveway of the Kahela Resort and Spa, the same resort Melissa had bragged about for weeks. Bellhops rushed to grab his suitcase, greeting him with leis and warm smiles. "Welcome to paradise, Mr. Harris." Paradise. That word felt different now. As John checked into his oceanfront suite, he walked out onto the private balcony and stared at the view. The Pacific stretched endlessly before him, waves crashing gently against the shore, the horizon painted in hues of gold and rose. He took a deep breath of the salty air and raised a glass of the welcome champagne. To Linda, he whispered, "This one's for us." That evening, he dined at the resort's oceanfront restaurant, the very one Melissa had squealed about while flipping through brochures. He savored every bite of fresh mahi-mahi and sipped wine as the sun melted into the horizon. Around him, other families laughed and toasted, but John didn't feel alone. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Back in Denver, Melissa's family was still stretched out on their own Hawaiian balcony, oblivious. They laughed, they snapped photos, they made plans for tomorrow's excursions. Not one of them knew that John was only a short walk away, living the very dream they thought they'd stolen from him. The irony was delicious. John leaned back in his chair, letting the sound of the surf fill his ears. He could imagine the look on Melissa's face when she returned to Colorado and found strangers living in her house. He could hear Eric's angry voice demanding explanations that would never come. He could picture Walter and Janet, so smug in their planning, suddenly realizing they had been outmaneuvered by the man they dismissed as too old. But that moment was still days away. For now, John had no intention of spoiling his own vacation. With thoughts of theirs, he'd waited 5 long years to breathe freely again. Tonight, with the ocean breeze on his face and Linda's picture resting beside him, he allowed himself the luxury of peace. They thought they'd left him behind. Instead, he was right here in the very paradise they had stolen for themselves. Only this time, the difference was clear. He was free, and they had no idea what awaited them back home. And as John drifted off to sleep to the rhythm of Hawaiian waves, he smiled to himself. Too old for adventures? No, I'm just kidding. Started. Back in Denver, the late summer sun was setting behind the Rockies when Melissa and Eric's SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac. They had just returned from their dream vacation, bronzed from the Hawaiian sun, still buzzing from luau's and sunset cruises. The kids were tired. Walter and Janet were bickering over where they had left the souvenirs. But Melissa's heart swelled with smug satisfaction. In her mind, everything was falling into place. Dad had been looked after while they enjoyed paradise. Soon the house would be sold, the nursing home paperwork completed, and their future secured. She fished for her keys, humming under her breath. But the moment she turned the lock at the front door, her smile froze. The key didn't fit. Melissa frowned, jiggling it, then tried again. "That's odd. Maybe the lock's jammed," Eric muttered, setting a suitcase down. He knocked loudly. A moment later, the door opened not to her father's familiar face, but to a middle-aged man in a crisp polo shirt. "Yes," the stranger asked, polite but firm. Melissa blinked, confused. "This is our house. Who are you?" The man tilted his head. "I think you're mistaken. This property belongs to Pinnacle Property Holdings. We closed on it last week. I'm the new tenant." Walter stepped forward, blustering. "That's impossible. This is David Harris's house. It's my son-in-law's father. We just went on vacation. There must be a mistake." The tenant shook his head and produced paperwork, neatly folded in a binder. "No mistake. Here's the deed transfer. Mr. Harris sold the home before moving out. Everything was handled legally." Melissa's face turned scarlet. "No, he wouldn't do that. This is our house." She tried to push past the man, but he blocked the doorway firmly. "I'm sorry, but if you don't leave, I'll have to call the police. You're trespassing now." Eric's jaw tightened, anger boiling over. "This is insane. We're calling our lawyer. You can't just sell our house without telling us." "Our house," the tenant repeated with a raised eyebrow. "You mean his house?" And yes, he could. He did. Now, if you'll excuse me, he shut the door with a decisive click, leaving them on the porch with their luggage. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the twilight. Melissa's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, dialing furiously, straight to voicemail. She tried again and again. No answer. Eric muttered curses under his breath, pacing. Walter and Janet stood dumbfounded, their faces pale. The children started to cry, frightened by the sudden shift in tone. Then, as if on cue, their neighbor Elizabeth stepped out onto her porch. She had lived next door for nearly 20 years, had watched Melissa grow up, had known Linda before her passing. Elizabeth. Melissa called desperately. "Do you know what's going on? Where's Dad?" Elizabeth walked over slowly, sympathy in her eyes but firmness in her voice. She handed Melissa a folded slip of paper. "Your father asked me to give you this when you came back. Your belongings are safe in storage. Here's the address." Melissa's fingers crumpled the note. "Storage? What do you mean, storage?" Elizabeth gave her a long look. "He moved everything out. Paid 6 months in advance. Said you'd find it there." Janet burst into tears. Walter shook his head, muttering, "I don't understand. He can't just disappear." Melissa dialed again, her phone screen glowing. With the words "call failed." "Why isn't he answering? Where is he?" Elizabeth's gaze softened. "All he told me was that he's gone. He said he'd reach out when he's ready." Melissa felt the ground tilt beneath her. Her father, the man she'd dismissed, ridiculed, and tried to cast aside, had slipped completely out of her grasp. The house was gone. Their belongings were boxed away. And he had vanished without leaving so much as a forwarding address. The weight of it hit her like a tidal wave. The inheritance she had counted on, the home she had seen as already hers, had evaporated. Her father hadn't been the gullible old man she thought. He had been one step ahead, quietly orchestrating his escape while she sipped Mai Tais on a Hawaiian beach. That night, in a cramped budget hotel off the interstate, Melissa stared at the ceiling in stunned silence. Eric ranted. Walter tried to calculate their next move. Janet sobbed quietly in the corner, but Melissa couldn't think of anything except the look on her. Father's face the last time she'd spoken to him, calm, almost amused, as if he had known this day was coming, and somewhere across the Pacific, John Harris was watching the same Hawaiian sunset they had claimed for themselves, free, unburdened, and savoring the justice they never saw coming. John Harris sat on the balcony of his oceanfront suite in Maui, the sound of waves crashing against the shore below. The sky was ablaze with color shades of pink, orange, and gold blending into the horizon. He held a glass of wine in his hand, Linda's photo propped gently against the railing beside him. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. And then his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Melissa's name. He let it ring. A moment later it buzzed again, this time then Walter, then Melissa once more. John watched the calls roll in, one after another, the device trembling on the glass table. He picked it up briefly and counted 12 missed calls in less than an hour. He placed the phone face down. For years, he had answered every ring, every plea for help, every midnight emergency about bills, groceries, or rent. He had been their safety net, their bank, their problem solver. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself the luxury of silence. Later that evening, he checked the voicemail. Melissa's voice was sharp, commanding at first. "Dad, I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't funny. Call me back immediately." The next message carried Eric's anger. "This is insane, David. You can't just sell the house. We'll get lawyers involved. You're going to regret this." By the 10th message, the tone had shifted. Walter's voice trembled. "Please, David, we don't understand. Just talk to us." And then came Janet, her words broken by tears. "Where are we supposed to go? How could you do this?" But it was Melissa's last message that struck John the most. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the entitlement. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Dad, please. We'll do anything. Just call us back. We have nowhere to go." John leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the glowing horizon. Nowhere to go. That was the same phrase they had used about him, plotting to dump him in a nursing home and take over his life. The irony was almost poetic. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Instead, he lifted his glass toward the setting sun. "Here's." To silence, he murmured, "The one thing they never gave me." The following morning, John woke to 27 more missed calls. Text messages flooded his screen, some angry, some pleading, some rambling with panic. He scrolled through them slowly, almost academically, like a teacher grading papers. Every message revealed something: their fear, their confusion, their dawning realization that they had lost the control they thought they held over him. And still, he did not answer. Instead, John spent the day exploring Maui. He strolled barefoot along the beach, the sand warm between his toes. He took a helicopter tour over volcanic craters, marveling at the sheer beauty of the island. He even signed up for a snorkeling trip, laughing softly to himself at the thought, too old for adventures. He swam among the coral, watched tropical fish dart around him, and came up for air with a grin he hadn't worn in years. That evening, while Melissa's family huddled in a budget hotel back in Denver, frantically redialing his number, John dined on the resort's terrace. Candlelight flickered on the table as a gentle breeze rustled the palms. The waiter refilled his glass, and John simply said, "Perfect." His phone buzzed again. He didn't even look at it this time. In that moment, John realized something profound. Silence wasn't emptiness. Silence was freedom. Every ignored call, every unanswered text, was a small victory. Each moment he allowed their voices to echo into the void was a reminder that he no longer lived under their thumb. For 5 long years, it controlled the narrative, deciding what he owed, what he should sacrifice, how he should live. But now, John controlled the silence. And in that silence, he found peace, power, and a dignity they had nearly stripped away. The ocean roared below, steady and timeless, reminding him that life had rhythms larger than family betrayal. Melissa could call 40 times or 100. Didn't matter. John Harris had chosen his freedom, and no ringtone in the world was strong enough to take it back. The second week of John Harris's Hawaiian escape brought a stillness he had almost forgotten could exist. He sat on the balcony of his resort suite, same one Melissa had bragged about in the brochures, and watched the sun climb over the Pacific. Morning light turned the water into a field of diamonds. He breathed deeply, letting the salty air fill his lungs. Asterisk beside him sat a simple photo frame Linda, smiling, her hand resting on his shoulder. She had never seen Hawaii, but John felt her presence in every wave, every breeze. "We made it, Lynn," he whispered softly. "And I didn't. Let them take this away from us." His phone lay silent on the table. By now, the missed calls numbered in the dozens, maybe more. Melissa had gone from fury to bargaining to desperate apologies. Eric's messages were laced with threats about lawyers, then pleas about the children. Walter and Janet had tried reasoning, guilt-tripping, even begging for another chance. But John hadn't answered once. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't the man they leaned on, drained and dismissed. He was simply himself, free, capable, and entirely in control. Every morning he walked the beach barefoot, waves curling around his ankles, at the horizon reminding him that life still held vastness. Every evening he dined beneath torchlight, savoring dishes Melissa once told him were too fancy for Dad. He laughed with strangers, swapped stories with other travelers, even signed up for a beginner's surf lesson, much to his own surprise. And through it all, he carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing what awaited Melissa's family back in Colorado, a rented storage unit filled with their belongings, a house deed they would never see again, and the unmistakable sting of consequences earned. Still, John didn't feel cruel. He didn't gloat. He felt balanced. For years, they had taken without giving, planned his life as if it belonged to them, and treated his love like weakness. Now, they knew the cost of mistaking kindness for gullibility. On his last evening in Maui, John sat by the fire pit near the resort's shoreline. The waves rolled in, steady, timeless. Around him, couples toasted their anniversaries. Families laughed over stories. Children roasted marshmallows. He sat quietly, sipping his drink, thinking about Linda, about Melissa, about the long, winding road that had brought him here. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about dignity. It's about reclaiming what they had tried to strip from him. He had spent his life running toward the fire, rescuing strangers, protecting his family, but in his later years, when he should have been cared for, he had been cast aside, and still he found the strength to fight back, not with anger, but with clarity, calculation, and a final act of freedom. As the stars appeared overhead, John whispered to himself, "This is my Independence Day." And maybe that was the lesson his family would finally learn. My friends, the story isn't just about John Harris. It's about every one of us who has ever been taken for granted, dismissed, or told we were too old to matter. Respect and gratitude are not optional. They're the very foundation of family. When others forget that, we have the right and the responsibility to remind them. Independence isn't just for the young. It's a gift we can claim at any age. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated? Share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. If you want to hear more stories of justice, family, and second chances, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You never know which story might speak directly to your own life, because sometimes greatest revenge isn't anger, it's freedom.